Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Today, we're sitting down to discuss Lanny by Max Porter, an atmospheric tale of life in a small English village and the fallout when a young child goes missing. It's the latest book read by my book club and was rapturously received by critics in 2019 when it also made various prize shortlists, including the Wainwright Prize and Waterstone's Book of the Year.
But never mind all that, what did Kate's book club make of it? Did it spark debate? And whether they loved it or loathed it, the big question is, was it a great book club book? Keep listening to find out.
So I was going to just dive straight in with the summary.
Yeah, go for it.
A child, a family, a village, a community built on ancient soil, sheltered to generations of lives and the tales they tell. For all time, dead Papa Toothwort has forever walked amongst them all. Now he is drawn again from his slumber, drawn to something new and precious, the boy Lanny. And on the Waterstones website they say, fearless, chimerical, and exquisitely formed, the latest book from Max Porter matches the audacity of his debut novel, Grief is the Thing with Feathers. Lanny is a tour de force of style, substance, and near mythic power that interrogates the very form of the book itself. I just thought it was quite helpful that just to give a sense of the way that it was received by the critical community. I mean, just review after review, people kind of almost tumbling over themselves to say in the most poetic way that they could think of, what an extraordinary read it was. And this is partly then why we came to choose it. It was such a buzz book of 2019 and we were quite intrigued. I had read his first book, Grief is a Thing with Feathers, before and loved it. So I pitched this to the group and we were quite keen to read it.
I have a special edition because they loved it so much. I think there are a couple special editions. I bought it on my Kindle when you first said you were reading it and got about 20 pages in and was like, oh, no, I must read this in print because the typesetting is so unusual. And that comes back to the style, with the design really reinforcing what makes this book so unusual. So we should really talk a little bit about the different voices that come through.
Yeah, I thought probably the best way to describe it is to read a little section. It has quite short sentences, sections of prose, and then interspersed there are these sections where it's much more fragments, little phrases, single words. It becomes much more like poetry. And that is set, as you mentioned, typographically. The words sort of curl around the page. It's not like a conventional book. It becomes visually something quite different as well. But I pulled out a little section that I thought gives a sense both of this character, Papa Toothwort, and of these kind of verbal choruses that you hear.
Ooh, verbal chorus. That's a good way to describe it.
Thanks very much. Dead Papa Toothwort wakes from his standing nap an acre wide and scrapes off dream dregs of bitumen, glistening thick with liquid globs of litter. He lies down to hear hymns of the earth. There are none, so he hums. And then he shrinks, cuts himself a mouth with a rusted ringpool, and sucks up a wet skin of acid-rich mulch and fruity detritivores. He splits and wobbles, divides and reassembles, coughs up a plastic pot and a petrified condom, briefly pauses as a smashed fiberglass bath, stumbles and rips off the mask, feels his face, and finds it made of long-buried tannic acid bottles, Victorian rubbish. And I'll skip on a little bit. He approaches the village, and he stands and he listens to the sounds that come up. Dead Papa Toothwort chews the noise of the place and waits for his favourite taste, but he hasn't got to it yet. I was a school teacher, so I know all about bumped heads. There are boyish saplings, girly saplings, and foot-high baby brackens. What's up, Dapper Two Chins? Uprooting a load of bluebells for 2 days of prettiness. Fat Pam on a scone and jam rampage. Told him buggered clutch, changed channels. Useful compost. Text him back. Roy's had another attack. Yashvi collects on weeknights. Fair enough, look at his missus over my dead body. I saw the carers going in, but Jean said they were past that point. Sturdy Jasmine. 20 press-ups and a 5-knuckle shuffle. Hark at me, planning a month ahead. Jugs of runoff. Recycling bags, tombola. Bang out of order. Pay as you go. Simply unwelcome. Brings up toxic masculinity every single book club. Elgaz, pissed as a newt. And then he hears it, clear and true, the lovely sound of his favourite, the boy.
And so the boy is Lanny. But before we get to Lanny, let's talk a little bit about dead Papa Toothwort, because it took me a little while to realize that he is the Green Man in English mythology.
Did you look up the Green Man or learn anything about the Green Man?
I did look up the Green Man. I had like a dim recollection that the Green Man was kind of a mythological creature made up of ivy and trees and all the bits of the forest, obviously reimagined here in Lanny as like covered in the detritus of modern day society, hence he's coughing up used condoms and the like. But that's all I really knew was, I think, the pictures that you sometimes see and which do get referenced in this book as we go on. How much did you know? Because you grew up in the English countryside.
I did, and also, ridiculously, I actually studied folklore at university. I took a module in it, and so I ought to know a lot more about the Green Man than I do. But what I couldn't remember, and I think is significant, is the Green Man a kind of positive figure, or is he a malign figure? And I think that's something that Max Porter really plays with here. This character, Papa Toothwort, is extraordinary. I think, for me, it's the most successful element of this book. He's just like nothing you've ever read, nothing you've ever thought of. And although he's a fantastical character who doesn't even have a single form, he kind of shapeshifts all the time. He's ever changing, ever evolving. He's timeless, he's ageless. He represents in some way the thread of history that goes back through the village to most ancient of times. It's tapping into something deeper, something kind of primal about nature, but also very much this idea of Englishness, which is sort of a strange thing to consider. It's a strange way, kind of quite parochial in a way that I think is really interesting.
And he draws his energy from the people, because although he is this mythological creature of nature, he couldn't really exist without the humans that live in his village, which is important to say. He feels great ownership of all that happens, and that's why he goes and navigates through the village and listens to these little tidbits of thought and commentary, which are genius. And actually, when you just read that passage, you picked out my favorite line, which was, brings up toxic masculinity every book club.
Every single time. Yeah, I like that one too. Yeah, I think it's really well observed. When I read those sections, it felt to me like Max Porter had kind of gone and just sat in a village and just made notes of all the things he overheard. They're very realistic. You really recognise them as things that people might say or things that you might overhear.
For example, special delivery and signed for are not the same thing. And I was like, are they not? Like, what is the difference between those two things? That's to do with
a good question.
That's to do with Royal Mail for our non-English listeners.
And also certainly not a problem now with people just putting things on your step and then running away as fast as they can. No one has to sign for anything anymore. It's brilliant.
So we've introduced Dead Papa Toothwort, and you're just leading into the boy. This is the eponymous boy. This is Lanny. How old is Lanny? What did you think? It's never said.
He's young enough. There's a sort of sweetness and a tenderness in his relationships with his parents that made me think he was younger rather than older. Because this is one of the things that you say goodbye to when they turn into teenagers, apparently, is that openness and trust and sort of loving relationship that they have with you. Apparently all that disappears. And then also there's an element of projection into the future where we see glimpses of what the teenage Lanny will be like. So that again makes you think he's sort of, I don't know, like 8 or 9 maybe, something like that.
I thought 8 or 9 because he is old enough that he can roam the village and his mother doesn't really worry about him, and that he's allowed to explore and he's allowed to go into the forest and play. So yeah, I thought maybe 8 or 9, but a young 8 or 9 because he's very whimsical. He's almost like a little elf. There's another word for it. He's away with the fairies. I think that's actually a phrase that someone uses to describe him at one point.
Yeah, so he's presented as someone who's very unusual, very bright, very creative. Again, a real positive force. You know, he's someone who has a gift for charming other people and people really warm to him. So he's not an outcast or anything like that. You know, he has friends and you get the impression he's much loved, but also he has this sort of distinct position as village eccentric. People are familiar with him, you know, oh, Lanny, there he goes again. There's an interesting dynamic which is about the relationship the parents have with the village because they've moved there from London. So they've upped sticks, they've moved to the countryside and they're living in this village in sort of home counties. So that's what we call the counties that are around London. And the husband, Robert, commutes into London every day to go and work in his banking job. So there is a real sense that they struggle slightly with this feeling of being outsiders, of not really belonging. But Lanny does belong in a way that perhaps they don't. And he's their anchor, which I thought was quite interesting. There's a local artist called Pete, I always saw him almost like a kind of Damien Hirst figure. He's someone who collects the skeletons of birds and paints them in gold leaf and, that kind of art.
Yeah, he reminded me of, not Damien Hirst, because I always think of Damien Hirst as being a bit too calculating, but Grayson Perry. He reminded me of a single solo Grayson Perry, because Pete lives in this village, he's had great fame, but he's alone. He's by himself. He doesn't have a family. And so when Jolie asks him to teach art to her son, he thinks, oh God, I couldn't possibly do that. But then actually thinks, well, why not? And then the two of them form this very, very close friendship, despite the huge difference between their age, probably about 60 years or so.
Yeah, it's lovely because it's just a real creative bond. And again, this character, Pete, I felt like he felt very realistic to me, very familiar, someone I could really imagine, someone who'd had great success as an artist, but now was sort of living quite quietly and had almost slightly turned his back on the bright lights quite deliberately because he really just wanted to be alone to explore his creative impulses, I suppose. And so Lanny very much fits into that.
Lanny's almost his muse.
Yeah, I was going to say they kind of bring out the best in each other. I think that's one of the really lovely threads in this book is this evolving relationship between the two. That's just a joy to read, really.
The book is divided into 3 parts, and the first part is told from the perspective of these 3 adults. So you have Lanny's mother, Jolie, who's an actress, or was an actress, and is now a stay-at-home mother. His father, Robert, who, as you say, commutes into the city every day, and is kind of a cad. And then Pete, the artist, and then Toothwort's commentary and the village mutterings kind of weave in and around these points of view. We're never taken into Lanny's point of view, really. We're always seeing him from the perspective of everyone else. But he does seem like a precious boy, and I thought that was really well realised, because it's kind of like with child actors, you can find portrayals of children quite annoying, and actually he did seem lovely and special to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think you really warm to Lanny. And again, there's something about him, even though he's so extraordinary and unusual, but actually that feels quite true. Max Porter, I've seen a couple of times in person doing author talks, and he's quite an extraordinary person. He's just very not your run-of-the-mill, as all his success obviously testifies. But when you meet him in person, he is incredibly charismatic, very funny, super, super, super bright. Like one of those people who's genuinely quite hard to follow because their thoughts are just flying off. And so when I read this, I felt like Lanny was almost like a kind of echo of perhaps what he was like as a child, or I don't know if, I think he does have children. Maybe he has a child like this. The point being that there just felt like there was something really true about it, or something that felt really true about it that I really liked. And so if it was, totally made up and he's complete random creation, it's very impressive because you don't feel like that when you're reading it. You feel like it's rooted in something. And that's important, I think, because you have to care about the Lanny character for the rest of the book to work. I should say there is a twist in this book towards the end that we didn't see coming and we liked very much, and that I absolutely don't want to spoil for people. So we won't tell people what the end of this book was. Laurie's looking puzzled. What twist? Was there a twist?
Is there a twist?
It's not like a huge plot twist, but it's a change of perspective, isn't it? That maybe you're not expecting.
True.
Given what you know of the Toothwort character. But which we liked very much, we thought worked really, really well. And it's in the setting up of those characters that enables that to work as well as it does, I think.
Gosh, I'm intrigued. We'll have to carry on this discussion
Talk about it off air.
I mentioned that this book is divided into 3 parts. I think for me, the first part and the second part are the most successful. The second part switches to snippets, really. It's almost like a play. Maybe a bit reminds me a little bit of Dylan Thomas, where instead of overhearing the villagers now, we are just being given short little snippets of commentary from everyone's perspective, all centered around the fact that Lanny has gone missing.
I had a couple of different responses to this because I read it twice. I read it once when my book club read it. And, it's that classic thing. When you read something the first time, you're sort of reading it for plot. And I actually found this second section, the search for Lanny and the missing child, and the parents' perspective on this and how they must be feeling. I found it almost impossible to read. I found it really, really, really hard. I mean, it is every parent's worst nightmare, or one of them. and it's tough, because it is well done. When I read it the second time, I was able to look at almost like how it was done more clearly, and I found it less successful than the first because I found that kind of polyphony of voices a bit confusing. It's suddenly you're hearing from characters that you haven't really heard from before, and it sort of mattered to me that I didn't know who they were. I got that it was building up an impression. I just felt If I'm being really critical, I just felt like it didn't quite work in the way that it needed to. But, like I said, it was such a different experience reading it the second time. The first time, when it was all about the emotion, I think, I don't know, obviously it worked fine or I wouldn't have cared.
Well, without giving anything away, I have to admit that I flipped to the end of the book because I'm a new mother and I was not ready to read about a missing child without knowing where it was going to go. Just emotionally prepare myself because I just had this real feeling of dread, and I just thought I can't keep reading this if I don't know where this is going to end up. So I skipped to the end, prepared myself, and then kept on reading. And that actually does help a little bit, to your point, where the first time if you read for plot, because you don't know what's going to happen, you kind of sort of skip over things, whereas at least I knew what was to come. And I take your point about it not being 100% successful. I think the first third of this book, that first part, I did feel like it was a work of genius. I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing, because he has such an ability with language and his vocabulary. I mean, come on, Max Porter. Dead Papa Toothwort is just so rich. The language is so dense and textural, and there's so many words in there that I've never even heard of half the time, but somehow he stitches it all together so you understand exactly what he's trying to get across. And then on the other hand, you have the parents' voices and Pete's voice, which then becomes perfectly crisp, clean 21st century prose. And that juxtaposition is really, really strong, I think. And then part 2, where you switch back and forth really quickly between the different villagers' voices, I thought was quite good. And then part 3, which, is it fair to say it's almost more like a dreamscape? That for me was the least successful. And I thought, okay, this isn't perfect. This isn't the work of genius I thought. Or if it is a flawed work of genius.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It made for such a good book club discussion book because I think there was that range of opinions on it.
Well, yeah, I really want to hear what people thought.
Well, so Andy, he's often good at skewering things. He said, I liked some of the writing, the idea of Old England and Papa Toothwort, but I didn't really get much of anything else. He actually read it a year ago, and so his point was that not much of it had stayed with him. And I kind of agreed with that. I felt like, yeah, this is an interesting experience reading it, but is it going to stay with me? Had it really changed me? I'm not sure it did. Hannah thought it was beautiful and loved its simplicity. She found it very tender, very moving book. Amanda said, I did think it was beautiful. Lots of the writing was surprising and original, and I was moved by it. For me, it knitted together very well, but I wasn't totally convinced. It was trying to be poetry, but not poetic enough, trying to be a novel, but with not enough of a story, and apart from Papa Toothwort, the characters felt fairly unoriginal. But he is a writer with a very singular voice, which is to be celebrated and enjoyed. I think, it was sort of almost like slightly negative in the comments, but actually when people gave it scores, it scored really well. I think people, basically we all enjoyed it and were really pleased that we'd read it and found it a really interesting. One of the things we were talking about is it's more of an experience reading it, sort of artistic experience in a way that perhaps you wouldn't normally think of a novel as being. And we liked that, but almost then it made it more fun to try and pick holes in it. And I think what's interesting about this is that I felt like I could pick holes in it in a way that grief is a thing with feathers. Have you ever read that?
No, I haven't.
So that is as extraordinary as the first part of Lanny, but with that it's sustained all the way through. It was just flawless for me and I couldn't pick it apart. You wouldn't be able to. And unfortunately, this does suffer a little bit in comparison to that.
We do have a lot of stereotypes in this novel, even with the little voices coming through. And although they are very recognizable, they are also sort of sound bites.
I mean, I felt when I was reading this, just the sense of recognition I had, which perhaps you wouldn't have had. But for me, this was my childhood village. I grew up in a village in the home counties. At the other side of my father's farm, it's an area we call the dump, which is just strange waste ground. But it was covered with trees and greenery, and we used to go there, us kids from the lane, we'd go there and we'd just roam around and we'd find these Victorian bottles. And I remember there was a tree with these porn mags in it that was very thrilling to, some sort of group of 9-year-olds. I cite that because what I loved about this was that mixture of beautiful and malevolent and things that are good and things that are kind of dirty and twisted and not good, and it's all mixed in together. And I just recognised that in a way that when I was reading it, I was thinking, God, how extraordinary that he could put this down on paper. I love that. I love it when you read things that no one's been able to quite articulate before and you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that recognition. I mean, this has so much of that and I love that.
I thought that the father figure was I mean, it was almost like Max Porter couldn't imagine someone working in banking in the city who wasn't a real dick.
I thought that character was a tricky one because, in a way, at the beginning, my problem with it was that I quite liked Robert, and I thought he had some brilliant perspectives on, he didn't want to have to go into London every day. He'd much rather be at home hanging out with Lanny, and I loved that. So, in a way, the problem with me was that I really liked that character and empathised with him at the beginning. And I think, obviously, then Max Porter decided he was going to make him into a sort of negative character. So all of that falls away, and it's almost like he couldn't quite bring himself to really truly make him into a negative character. So what happens is he just becomes very underwritten, quite kind of blank, and you get these little asides from other characters that give you a little bit of insight into what he's like, and it doesn't quite ring true with that very early portrait where you really heard his thoughts and, the things that made him tick.
That's very true. And actually, even his wife doesn't respond to him. It's as if his wife doesn't know that side of him. And surely if anyone would have known it, it would have been her, at least at some point in the early years of their marriage.
Yeah, so I think that's little things like that, but are the way that perhaps for me this was a little bit flawed in the way that the other book just wasn't. But I agree with you. I think that first third is so strong, and overall, we talked about this at book club. It's such a wonderful original kind of voice and point of view. It's not really like anything else we've read. We were so happy to have read it. There's a real place for this, and it feels just great that someone is writing in this way.
So a very good book club book then.
Such a good book club book. Really good. I think, a perfect combination of short book, so much to it, really pushes you a little bit. You have to make a bit of an intellectual leap to kind of keep up with it in some ways, and that's always really good. And yet, just flawed enough that we all had a really nice time saying, well, I just think this didn't work, or blah, blah, blah. It's always good to be able to do that.
I completely see that because I read it and was desperate to talk about it with you.
So it was a great one. Highly recommended. Can't wait to see what he's going to write next.
Inspired by Max Porter's Lanny, here are some more recommendations for your next book club read.
I'm going to recommend Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss, which I read a while back and which I think we have discussed, haven't we, on one of our bookshelf episodes. I'll put the link into the show notes for anyone who wants to hear more, but for now, teenage Sylvie and her parents are living in a hut in Northumberland as an exercise in experimental archaeology. Her father is a difficult man, obsessed with imagining and enacting the harshness of Iron Age life. Haunting Sylvie's narrative is the story of a bog girl, a young woman sacrificed by those closest to her, and the landscape both keeps and reveals the secrets of past violence and ritual as the summer builds to its harrowing climax. It's the sort of book you read in one sitting. It really draws you in. It's absolutely beautifully written. There's a kind of intellectual rigour that I think makes it a really fair companion to Lanny. It's got that component of nature writing and an interest in landscape and our experiences of that landscape and being in it that ties in very nicely with Lanny, and the idea of a sort of supernatural figure as well, or a sort of a slipping between times. I just loved it. I thought it was such a brilliant, powerful read. It was my discovery of Sarah Moss. It was my first thing that I read by her, and she is such an amazing writer. And I think this would be a great one for book club because there's lots to pull out and discuss.
I keep meaning to read that. I really like to. It feels like the kind of book that I want to read in print, so maybe I need to borrow your copy.
Yeah, although it's not got any of the sort of preciousness of Lanny, so I think you could quite happily read it on a Kindle. It's just such a powerful read, and I think as a jumping off point, provoke loads of different discussions. But yeah, no, she's so great. I love Sarah Moss.
Thinking about my recommendations today, I was looking through my bookshelves for something that would kind of riff on some of the themes of Lanny. And the first one I picked up was a book called Gwelio, a memoir of a Hong Kong childhood by Martin Booth. And Martin Booth was a very successful writer. He died in February 2004. Have you ever read him?
No, I've never heard of him.
He was longlisted for a Booker at some point. I don't know his other novels. But this memoir was written shortly before he died, and it recounts his childhood living in Hong Kong in the early 1950s. And the reason I took it off the shelf was because as a portrait of childhood and of a child's understanding of the world, it is so beautiful, and it kind of has something similar to Lanny in that perspective of trying to capture that time in a child's life between 7 and 11, when they're able to go out and explore by themselves and to make connections with people beyond their parents. And certainly in the 1950s, Martin Booth was able to roam widely over Hong Kong, and he learned Cantonese, and he made friends with the locals, and he explored, and he'd get into mischief. No one really worried about him. We also have a portrait of his parents' relationship. in this book, which was really quite unhappy. His father was a kind of stick-in-the-mud civil servant, whereas his mother was this beautiful, warm, free spirit who moved to Hong Kong and just sunk into the culture and learned Cantonese like her son and made friends with everyone she met. And you get that disconnect, that alienation within the marriage comes through really poignantly, even as Martin Booth's obviously remembering it many decades later and piecing together an understanding that he wouldn't really have had as a child. So a very beautiful book. And, you know, we're all stuck at home right now, wherever that might be. So the fact that this takes you into Hong Kong as it was in the 1950s, I think is a really delightful escape from the present day.
Well, that sounds perfect.
But actually, your recommendation of Ghostwall made me think of another book on my shelf, which was in fact a book club book, though a book club book before the podcast started. And that's The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. Did you read that?
Yes.
Did you like it?
I liked it more than you did.
My book club read The Essex Serpent, which is a gothic Victorian tale of these villagers on the Thames estuary who believe that there is a serpent in the estuary and kind of terrorizing them, and there's sort of a communal psychosis leaching through the community and hysteria. People love this book, I should say. And I think it was Waterstone's Book of the Year, and it sold in the hundreds of thousands, maybe in the millions. And perhaps for that reason, my book club was really, really critical of it. The lead character is this very anachronistic woman who, you know, heads out to find the serpent. And it does feel just a bit like wish fulfillment for what it might have been like. The characters are much more woke than they have any right to be if this was set, given this is set in the Victorian times. But it is all about English land and English myth, and you do have a real sense of time and place. So yes, I think this would be another good book inspired by Lanny. And hey, my book club didn't really like it, but we had a fantastic discussion.
Because there are other elements where it connects up as well. There's the idea of art, and there's the character who suffers tuberculosis and she collects blue things. And yes. I love that strand of that book. I thought that was really beautifully written. The idea of this woman who's increasingly surrounded by these blue objects, and there's something sort of translucent about her. And I thought all that was wonderful. That's really stayed with me. And this idea of a creature that, is it supernatural? Is it something
dreamt up by kind of human consciousness?
Exactly. That's sort of coalesced from people's thought. There's this real kind of ambiguity to it. I think, hey, folks, I liked it.
So as you
Although
see,
I would acknowledge some of the criticisms, definitely, but for me, on balance, I thought it worked. So yeah, good book club book.
That's all for this episode.
Our book recommendations were Ghostwall by Sarah Moss, Gwelio, Memories of a Hong Kong Childhood by Martin Booth, and The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. And we'll list those in our show notes as well.
On our next book club show, we'll be discussing Kim Ji-young, born 1982, by the South Korean author Cho Nam-ju. It's a short, sharp novella chronicling the chronic injustices and misogyny experienced by one woman through the course of her life. It sold in the millions in South Korea and sparked off the nation's own Me Too movement, as well as ongoing rancor between the sexes. But did it make for a good book club book? Listen in to find out.
But first, keep an eye out for our interview with Elizabeth Morris, the brain behind Crib Notes, the book's newsletter for new and busy mothers. That's available to listen to now, as is our latest bookshelf episode, dedicated to the books we've each been reading outside of book club, with a particular emphasis on comfort reads during this time of corona crisis.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or you can always email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate, review and subscribe to us. It helps other listeners find us and means you'll never miss an episode.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.